I wanted to start off with Thomas. So biotech very often gets grouped with tech, but it plays by very different rules. So what makes it fundamentally different when it comes to risks, when it comes to timelines, and especially the type of capital that it needs today as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's pretty simple. Biotech, we never have revenue. So that alone makes it completely different than any other investment area. And there's an aspect of philanthropy for profit that kind of takes hold, for better or worse, in terms of allocators and the impact that makes. But I mean, the real difference is you can never march out kind of the cost. So
it's a cost thing, basically.
Well, I mean, you can lose money, like some of these AI companies are losing money, but they're still making some money. Our companies will generally never make any money, and they'll be sold for a kind of future revenue potential without ever pocketing a dollar. So it's a 100% burn.
Wow. Dr. Luke, when governments talk about supporting biotech, then where do you think they tend to get it wrong? What is commonly sort of misunderstood about the innovation in all of this?
I mean, I think government investment basically into training is really important, and also into basic science that is not profitable on a 10-year horizon is a good public commitment. I think where government has not done a good job is on the context of training PhD scientists how to think translationally to make really real medicines. That's largely ignored or was considered sort of like beneath the academic endeavor, which is really short-sighted.
Right. Eric, public money clearly has a role sort of early on, right? So there is a delicate balance in all of this. So how can funding, incentives, and regulation really support this type of early stage research without discouraging this type of private investment at the same time?
Absolutely, no, that's a great question. I would say without the public funding of basic research, the initial exercise of trying to discover important scientific breakthroughs, I don't think there's private money ever comes to the picture, because there is a massive risk that's involved in there. And these are oftentimes, as Tom said, in biotech, you're really, particularly early on, you're investing in science projects that may or may not realize and have a return on it. So after a lot of money being spent, the scientists like Luke would discover a molecule and publish it and print the IP, etc. And then after some de-risking event happens to a certain level, and that's still every time, like every project that starts, even at the molecule level, 90% of it fails. So that's a very big number. So it's very hard to see the private investors risking that capital up front. And so public money is critical to fund that research.
Thomas, what's your take on that as well then, in terms of the risk around all of this and how to build trust at the end of the day as well?
I think the risk is, well, let me step back. It's, I think healthcare and personal health are kind of a different category of, for humans. So for example, like if, say my daughter, God forbid, had some type of disease, like it wouldn't matter my religion, my country, like anything, like if, like, you know, if there was a cure in like Pyongyang, North Korea, like I'd be there right now, I wouldn't be here. So it kind of supersedes everything else. And so the risk is always worth it. I think often in my industry, we'll say the fact to hype ratio is really large. So there are kind of no, you know, we'll hear a lot here about, you know, longevity or like psychedelics or how AI is going to transform science. And those things will maybe, but most likely not. It's kind of like the lab work and the hard work is what's going to lead to great outcomes. And you got to have to be capital efficient. One thing, if you all look at kind of the public boards of our industry, and Eric and Luke know this as well, is they're not the most diverse because most people are actually doctors and scientists on them. And that might be kind of one of the bigger issues facing our industry, is we don't have unique capital allocators involved in the company, because everyone, including governments, they feel like they don't know enough to be involved. And one issue with doctors, like I have doctors in my family, they tend to be terrible investors, and medical doctors at least, it's a big issue. So part of it's kind of evolving that space. to have more sophisticated investors involved.
I just wanted to stay with you for a moment because it does seem, though, that a lot of these regions are sort of pulling ahead and building globally competitive biotech hubs. So what do you think they've done right and what are the lessons learned?
I don't think that's true. It's just, I think that there are arbitrages that exist. I don't know if Daniel, when he was up here, talked about kind of the Australia arbitrage, where we run a lot of clinical trials there because they've set up better infrastructure. They have a single payer system. They have hospitals that are centralized. The US can't compete. Or if you look at China in terms of manufacturing costs and clinical trial patients that are there, you have an arbitrage in terms of cost. But where most innovation is still happening is in the US. Right. And it's hard to replicate that. It doesn't mean people can't. It's just the risk capital exists in the US. It doesn't exist in Europe. I mean, it probably exists more here than in Europe even. But the population plus the risk capital is what really makes a difference here. Dr.
Luke, over to you. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I would double down on Europe being risk averse. If you fail once in Europe, you're out, whereas there are funds in the US where they will only fund people who've already failed because you've already learned the hard lessons and how to do this, right? And so that's a totally different risk appetite. I think other parts of the world could, have new ideas to contribute to biotech innovation. I hope to see a day where it's not just, Boston and San Francisco and a few other hubs. That should be a global endeavor. There are different problems in different places and people have different perspectives, which will be valuable.
So where's the best place to learn from these different types of hubs that have been developed? Do you think it's the US then?
I think, honestly, these kinds of conversations and being outside the US maybe strikes, new partnerships or new ideas that drive innovation. I think what's very hard to what needs to be replicated is also the educational base. You need the ground level scientists who just graduated with a PhD, who are super hungry and really talented, and you need a certain density of that. And so I know that universities get good and bad press for a variety of reasons, but in terms of science education, I think that's the starting point of biotech innovation.
So Eric, if you look across the whole full biotech journey, where do you think governments should be most hands-on and where do you think they should step back?
Yeah, absolutely. I think governments should certainly be very hands-on and very early on by building the infrastructure and establishing the ecosystem. Because as Luke said, I think the ecosystem is critical here. When you think about the most successful biotech stories, or they come out of the hubs. Like for instance, Boston has become a hub around the university support system there. San Francisco is a hub, and Basel in Switzerland is a hub, right? Cambridge in the UK is a hub. So I think all of that is important, and governments, particularly places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, establishing these sort of ecosystems is going to be critical for that to flourish. The second piece of it is the broader early investing, in addition to research I highlighted before at the university level, basic research, but also the GMP manufacturing facilities, the incubation labs, because oftentimes these, the postdocs or the faculty at these universities have great ideas, but don't have the resources to bring their projects into fruition without some support. I think the visionary governments, I would say, could play a very big role in playing to get that from the very, very early to, say, let's say, clinic or right before clinic. Then I think the government should hand it over to the private investors. Certainly can establish some milestone-based sort of incentive, et cetera. But then eventually, I think on the regulatory side, governments are also very important, playing a role. For instance, Daniel and I actually were talking, Dr. Getz, yesterday about, and Tom alluded to it, when we think about the time from, a development candidate nomination, as they say in biotechnology, sort of call it mid-stage preclinical, into a 10-patient data, you do that in 2.5 years in the US with $50 million, very average. In Australia, it's 2.5 years, $15 million. And in China, 6 months and $6 million, right? As a rough numbers. So when you think about that, government enabling the support, this fast moving, enabling the clinical trials and establishing that infrastructure, making it more affordable to do these things, could be very, very effective in building that ecosystem and supporting the private investors funding sort of more of the mid-stage, if you will.
Thomas, where do you think government should step in and step back? At what point?
Well, the U.S. had one of the more successful scientific funding kind of approaches and kind of the best FDA. And I think what the government is typically really good at it, and where their focus should be, at least speaking for the U.S., is on safety. So when the FDA started, the goal was to prevent kind of bad things from happening. And over 50 years, it became much more about efficacy, whereas often the market will determine that. And so most of the cost goes into efficacy. So the first, going from a science project to phase 2 is on average about $750 million if you start from the beginning in terms of cost. And then it's about $750 to go from phase 2 to kind of approval, if you divide it in those two. I think that where countries like Australia or China have kind of left ahead of the US is in getting patients access much more quickly to drugs they wouldn't otherwise have. Now, part of that, just in the weeds a little bit, is China represented about 3% of clinical trials globally in 2018. I think right now it's like 53%, and that's how quickly it's grown. But it's multifactorial. One of the reasons is not just that they're more kind of centralized in their clinical trial sites, it's that patients have no standard of care, so they haven't been what we'll call contaminated by other clinical trials. Most Americans have such high access to clinical trials that they're in 10, 11 trials, and that creates really confounding issues for kind of the FDA or for government agencies to actually figure out what's going on. And so that, I think, has driven it much more, and is kind of the real reason people don't really talk about it, but it's these patients have no treatment, so they're purer. And so, there's pros and cons to that. But the government should just fund the best people, and in my view, and let them get out of the way.
Well, that leads me really nicely into to Dr. Luke in terms of how policymakers can really sort of tell the difference between long-term strategic biotech investments and the short-term hype and the sort of, the big headlines, the big promises. How do they separate the two?
I mean, hype cycles start with a good idea, right? They start with a genuine good idea that has the potential to change the world, and then, for better or worse, that becomes overheated. It's sort of just human nature when you see a good idea to latch onto that, but at some point it becomes too much and too many, and you get charlatans and opportunistic folks. And so I think these hype cycles are like almost a required part of human progress, and that's destructive for a variety of reasons, especially for capital and people's careers and things like this. But I don't really, unless you were to impose complete government control on everything, I don't see how you avoid this, at least in the US.
Well, I suppose it's the best way to bring something to the public awareness at the end of the day, and making the big headlines and everything else, and driving this sort of sector forward. But then it's knowing when to separate the hype from the reality. Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation yesterday with a guy who lives here who runs a big fund, and he brought up a biotech that just raised $200 million based on AI and drug discovery in the US. A friend of his was an investor, and I just told him flat out, I would short sell this. I don't believe this science. So I think investors need to maintain deep connections to serious scientists who are objective and don't have any financial incentive to, go one way or the other. Admittedly, I could be wrong. And in the context of deadly human diseases, I always hope I'm wrong. I root for everybody to succeed. So I would love to be wrong about this company, but I would never put my own money into it because I think it's a overhyped bubble. Can you give us a good example of something that's been a true success story then? Well, I mean, this is part of the conversation, right? So hype cycles start with a good idea, they get too big, and then in biotech and in medicine, they pay out 10 years later. So if you use genome editing as an example, started in 2012, was way overheated from 2012 to 2020. Now, if you read the news, everybody's really negative about this because it was a lot of money invested and it's been, a decade. We'll see the payout over the next 10 years because it takes a long time to run those trials and do all the safety work. And so I wouldn't bet against it. It's just, where there was a gap in terms of actual real world efficacy in patients' lives. So it really takes a long time to
Takes a
see
long
those
time.
results and the ROI and things like that. We are running out of time, sadly not enough time for these sessions. But I wanted to ask all three of you the same question just to wrap up really, which is when governments invest in biotech, what does success actually look like, do you think? Who would like to go first?
I'll go first. It's having an impact on children, on older folks, and real world across the globe too, not just in the rich countries. So that is a global success story.
Eric, would you like to go?
Sure, I'll go next. So I think government improving lives broadly. I mean, I not only think about the longevity, there was an earlier session as well, but talking about better quality lives, also very important. That I think when the investments made in medicines, I think it's really investing in the future and investing in the betterment of the society, and I think that's very, very important. I think that's the idea.
Do you think sort of financial return, health outcomes, national resilience, is it a combination of all of those? Because obviously, it's the health outcomes is the priority, but is it a combination of what a complete success story would look like for a government?
I would say no, absolutely. I think it's a combination of all. I do think sometimes what mistakes are made by the governments is not having sort of a real accountability and also being part of the picture, but leaving the private sector do their thing, if you will, right? And I think it's important for the governments to have some level of oversight as they're investing, but broadly speaking, I think it's important also that they don't become sort of a bottleneck, because it's not an area of expertise for any government, if you will, to make certain decisions during the life cycle of a biotech project, which may be different from other industries, if you will, because as Luke said, even the subject matter experts don't really know and what actions to take sometimes, and a perfect execution isn't a guarantee of success in the space. But the outcomes are very, very rewarding, both financially and strategically for the society at large.
Thank you so much. Thomas, over to you.
Where the government can be most helpful, I think that obviously it's focusing on the 1, 2, or 3 things that actually matter, which is safety, eliminating perverse incentives, and kind of being like really vigilant on kind of cronyism within in terms of the HHS in the US and the FDA, and really holding folks accountable. That kind of is the best example for the rest of the world, and we lost that a little bit, but still, those are the 3 things. Most people in our industry, like they're doctors and scientists, their goal is to help patients. That's why they went into it. Like I'm an MD and PhD. Like I'm doing this because the outcomes are transformative. I mean, and just when I started at Duke, and I probably told this story last year, maybe the year before, but it's like metastatic lung cancer and metastatic melanoma, like these were like diseases people died, like basically everyone died within 5 years. And from 2012 to 2018, my time at Duke, like the survival went from 5% of people alive in 5 years to over 55%. And so those are that's like a real outcome. Like that is a meaningful change where, my parents would say, stage 4 cancer is 100% a death sentence, and now they have stage 5. And so that's kind of the progress, and that's a single drug. That's Keytruda, that's a PD-1, just as an example. Like that's a dramatic outcome for patients. And that's kind of what we're looking for. I think one more thing is not incremental, and you see a lot of conversation in the US, not incremental change. Like 1 month survival increase is not necessarily worth the economic cost when most doctors themselves wouldn't take the treatment. Like the most likely people in the US to not get treatment when they know it's not gonna work are doctors. They're the least costly in the last year of life because they know. And so actually having real conversations about is it worth getting a treatment when instead of maybe living an extra month and having terrible side effects, you could go to Hawaii or go somewhere else and actually spend time with your family. What's actually going to help you live longer, that time with your family, or that extra month with a drug that causes really bad side effects. And so really focusing on transformative change is kind of what venture is about and what scientists are looking for everywhere.
Very well said. We cannot thank you enough. I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's always going to be a huge element of risk. There's always going to be, an innovation, but there's always going to be reward at the same time. And we've just got to keep going and just make sure that we get to that sort of place that we want to be in the end. But we cannot thank you enough for being with us here today. That was our final session, by the way, here on the Future of Health track. And thank you so much. Brilliant to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.